Now, when I left you, we were working on knit one, purl one rib. I've thrown several rows on there now, and you can see the structure of the rib much more easily, and you can see that it does quite naturally pull itself together. So that is a really useful way of creating a nice snug cuff around the cuff of a sweater, or around the waist of a sweater, or around the neck, or around the brim of a hat, to make sure it stays in nice and neat against your head. So today we have learned knit stitch, garter stitch, we have learned purl stitch, garter stitch, we have produced some stocking stitch, and we've produced some knit one, purl one rib. And of course we started by learning to cast on. So now we get to the bit which I learned as casting off. The Americans like to call it binding off. Don't understand why, but then again, I don't understand some of the other terminology they like to use, other than the fact that they think it's cute, some of it. I always ripped things out. They talk about frogging it because you rip it, and rip it sounds like ribbit, and ribbit sounds like a frog. I rip things out. They also talk about tinking being the word knit spelt backwards, but they don't realise that in other countries the word tink can have a racial connotation, and when you explain it to them they go, oh! So if you come across the term tink, it just means to rip out your knitting, or to knit backwards. And they don't literally mean knit backwards, they mean unpick or rip out. Okay, so we're going to cast off or bind off, and the simplest one involves knitting, and only knitting. So we knit a stitch, we knit a second stitch, we put a needle into the front leg of that stitch, and we lift it over and leave one stitch on the right hand needle. We knit another stitch, we're back to 2, needle in, lift the back one over the front one, we're back down to 1. Knit a stitch, needle into the back stitch, lift it over the front one, knit a stitch, needle into the back. Now it is also possible when you're doing this to use whatever stitch appears in front of you. So if I see a purl stitch, I could purl that one, move my yarn to the back, I'll lift the previous stitch over, then I'm at a knit stitch, I can knit it, and again needle into the back stitch, lift it over, bring my yarn to the front because I've got a purl stitch, and I can purl the purl stitch, take the yarn to the back out of the way, and lift the back stitch over the front stitch. Then I have a knit stitch, and again I can lift the back stitch over the front stitch, yarn to the front because I'm finishing with a purl stitch, move the yarn to the back out the way again, lift that over there, and really simply, this is where a pair of scissors would have been handy, but I didn't bring any out with me. You're going to snap your yarn. Now if you look at it, the first half was where I was only using knit stitches. The second half was where I was working a purl or a knit, or a purl or a knit. There's a very slight difference, and the difference isn't on the top, the difference is actually here. in here you can see that there's a knit stitch every time. Right, so above that column of purls there is a knit stitch, and if you want a really neat edge, it's good to have that purl continue right up to the top. So although you'll get away with that one, very few people will notice the difference. If you're being really pedantic and you want to guarantee that anyone who looks at it in fine detail sees that you followed the pattern all the way through to the end, you can work whatever stitch is directly below your cast off. That finishes your basic information. Cast on, knit, purl, stocking stitch, knit one, purl one, rib, and casting off. Thanks a lot. Bye.